Good afternoon. My name is Caroline Quilici, and I'm the Director of Events here at Jack London State Historic Park. We are thrilled that you have decided to join us as we celebrate our incredibly talented local author, Iris Jamahl Dunkle, who is introducing her much anticipated new biography of Charmian Kittredge London, Trailblazer, author, and adventurer. It's especially fitting that we are streaming here live from the House of Happy Walls, which was Charmian London's former home here at Jack London Park. Before I want to continue, if you haven't yet had the opportunity to pick up one of Iris's books, I personally am halfway through it, and it is absolutely dazzling. So if you would like to order one, you may do so through the website here at the park, which is www.jacklondonpark.com, and just go to the website and order a book, and I promise you will not be disappointed. I wanted to share a few details about our beloved Iris before we begin. Iris Jamahl Dunkle writes and lives here in Northern California. She has received many honors and awards for her writing. She was 2017-2018 Poet Laureate of Sonoma County, California, and has received fellowships from the Vermont Studio Center, the Lannan Foundation, and Squaw Valley Community of Writers. Her newest collection of poems, West Fire Archive, is forthcoming from the Center for Library Publishing in 2021. Her works have been published in Tin House, San Francisco Examiner, Fence, Los Angeles Review of Books, Split Rock Review, Taos Poetry Journal, Pleiades, Calyx, Catamaran, Poets Market, Women's Studies, and the Chicago Quarterly Review. She wrote the first full-length biography on Charmian London, Jack London's wife, Charmian Kittredge London, Trailblazer, author, adventurer, which was published by the University of Oklahoma Press in fall 2020. Dunkle teaches at Napa Valley College and is the poetry director of the Napa Valley Writers Conference. Dunkle's writing challenges the Western myth of progress by looking closely at the devastating impact agriculture and overpopulation have had on the environment of the West. This work was inspired by her time as Poet Laureate in Sonoma County in 2017, when the county was faced with devastating wildfires. Her past work has also engaged in documenting the history of destruction and restoration of one of the largest watersheds in Northern California, the Laguna de Santa Rosa, and the impact both environmentally and socioeconomically of the oil industry on Western Pennsylvania in the 1860s. In 2020, her biography on Charmian Kittredge London, Jack London's wife, was published by the University of Oklahoma Press, a biography that questions and rewrites the narrative presented of Jack and Charmian London by fictional biographers like Irving Stone by recreating Charmian's life. Dunkle believes that biography can be revolutionary. It can also challenge ideas that have been set in history, and through careful research, resurrect the lives of those who may have been misremembered. Charmian was a new woman, an author, and an adventurer whose accomplishments and disruptions history had all but forgotten. She is currently researching and writing her next biography on the fascinating life of the Western writer Sonora Babb. And now, without further ado, and because we have much and long anticipated this incredible book from Iris Jamahl Dunkle, I'd like to welcome to the setting here Iris and her amazing book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's such an honor to be here at Jack London State Park to launch Charmian's biography in her own home. And so I want to begin with a toast to Charmian, and thank you, and to all of you for joining me here today to celebrate Charmian's life. So, and if you do buy a copy of the book through the Jack London State Historic Park by going to the website, I will be signing every single one personally. So if you want to sign a copy, it's a really great way to do it, and also support Jack London State Historic Park. So I wish we could all be together, but because there are pandemics and now wildfires, it's not safe for us all to gather. And I do hope that in the future, we will be able to gather in person. But as you've heard, Charmian Kittredge London, for those of you who don't know, was the wife of Jack London. But she was so much more than that. And in this biography, I hope to show you who she was beyond that title. Many people ask me why I'm writing about Charmian, what drew me to really write about this woman. And what I discovered once I got to know her is that the truth is she's the type of woman I would have wanted to hang out with. I started coming to Jack London State Historic Park when I was just in the 6th grade. And before that field trip, I didn't know that you could have a career as a writer. There weren't writers that visited the school or anything like that. It was the only place I'd ever seen what I did with all my time as a future career goal. And so I owe a lot to this park, and it's such an honor to get to launch something I've worked the last 6 years on right here. So I'm going to start by, I wanted to mention, if while I'm talking you have any questions, there's a chat function. Just type them in there, and after I give my reading, I'll be answering questions as they come in. So I'm going to begin by reading part of the preface. I'm going to introduce you to the story of why I started writing about Charmian and why I feel like this story is important. I first discovered Jack and Charmian when I was in the 6th grade on a field trip to Jack London State Historic Park in Glen Ellen, California. It was the first time I'd encountered a real writer, one whose life I could see and touch through artifacts. And in some ways, that encounter gave me license to become a writer myself. It was, of course, Jack London who I fell in love with, his mind like a jar full of bees, the perfect lines of his muscled body. But what I didn't realize at the time was that on that day, I also encountered another writer, one who few people know much about, who would haunt me until I could tell her full story, recreated from the artifacts of her life. In later years, after studying literature and becoming a professor and a writer, I returned to the park as a volunteer, running a book discussion group with another Jack London scholar. One of the books we chose to read and discuss was the book of Jack London, the biography that Charmian wrote about her husband shortly after his death. By this time, I had read all the biographies written about Jack London, but none, in my opinion, recreated the man I saw emerge from the second volume of Charmian's book. Sitting under the oaks at the park, I realized that Charmian was quite different from who I thought she was. She wasn't the stereotype I'd come to know her as, the airhead, bossy, needy wife. She was ambitious and adventurous, and she did not fit the gender norms that regulated the time when she lived. Aside from a few exceptions, including the important work of Clarice Stas in her books American Dreamers and Jack London's Women, Earl Labor's biography Jack London and American Life, and the recent issue of Women's Studies edited by Amy Tucker, which was dedicated to scholarly articles on Charmian, up to this point, the story of Jack London's life, and subsequently Charmian's, has always been researched and told with Jack London at its center. My realization at the park set me on a quest to find out who Charmian really was. What happened when I dug into the archives, read her extensive diaries, letters, and travel logs, and saw her photo albums, maps, and artifacts? When I looked at city and county records, census data, and old newspapers, was that a different story began to emerge, one quite different from the one I had previously known. How different a story can be when we look at it from the perspective of a woman. What happens when we switch the perspective through which we perceive history? When we let go of a set historical narrative and begin to dig up the forgotten letters and diaries and photographs and artifacts, a different story emerges, one much closer to the truth. Women's stories emerge, stories where women challenge the stereotypes we've set for them, stories where women persevere, are independent, and hold power. When you walk into Charmian's former home, the House of Happy Walls, in Glen Ellen, California, you immediately encounter Charmian's strong presence. She was clearly no lightweight who held back her husband's career. She was a modern woman. She didn't abide by the conventions that governed feminine behavior in the early 1900s. She was intelligent. She was an intelligent woman who lived a creative life. She was warm, as Joy Schaefer, the granddaughter of Jack's stepsister Eliza Shepard, attests. And she valued and fostered relationships with her friends and relatives during her life. She worked hard every day during the productive years of her life. However, she was also a fiercely private woman. She valued having a room of her own, a place to be creative. In fact, the floor that I'm reading to you from is her private area of the House of Happy Walls. She was a woman who found joy in the everyday, in the fog that rolled down from Sonoma Mountain at the ranch, in the sunsets that illuminated the sea. She loved adventure. From her early days, she rode horses and preferred to spend months at sea. She was a serious writer who wrote 4 books and thrived as a travel writer. Charmaine was the kind of woman you would have loved to have known. She was brave, she was free-spirited, and she didn't give up. My aim in this book is to take you on the adventure of her life, to show you how this modern woman did not succumb to the social pressures that form the idea of femininity for her day. Instead, Charmian lived an independent life and fought to become a writer. So my book begins by describing, it starts in medias res. So it starts by describing one of the events that really led to the erasure of Charmian's life, and from the story of Jack London. Her encounter with Irving Stone and the subsequent publication of his fictional biography, Sailor on Horseback. So it's after that section, we go back to the beginning, to who Charmian's parents were. She had her mother, Dale or Daisy Wiley, was from Wisconsin, and she came over with her family on a wagon train all the way to Salt Lake City, where she met Willard Kittredge, her father. He came to California from Mount Desert Island. He was from a shipping family, and then became, after making money in the gold rush, he became a Union soldier and then a captain, and ended up stationed in Salt Lake City, and that's where they met. They did live locally. For those of you who are from Sonoma County, they lived in the American Hotel in Petaluma. Kit ran that for a while. But I'm going to jump ahead to a scene that I think all of you will enjoy. This is the first time that Charmian met Jack London. And she was introduced by her aunt, Nanetta Ames, at the time. Even though Netta still belittled her with nicknames like old woman or childy, Charmian's confidence in herself continued to grow. In the spring of 1900, she was 28 years old and working for E. Mickle and Company, one of the largest shipping firms in San Francisco. She even had a personal assistant reporting to her. She was engaged to Will Minstrel, but was not sure he was worth leaving her career over. Married women weren't allowed to keep jobs as stenographers at E. Mickle and Company, no matter how good they were at their jobs. One day, as she returned from a long day at work, she encountered a young man leaving Netta's house. He was dressed in bicycle trousers, a woolen shirt, and bicycle shoes. His name was Jack London, and he was then 24 years old. Charmian had overheard Netta and Roscoe discussing his Yukon stories, which had been appearing in the Overland since January 1899. But she had not yet read any of them. She went inside and said mockingly to Netta, "So that's your wonderful Jack London?" Netta chuckled and told her that his genius was so great, she soon wouldn't even notice his clothes. A few days later, Charmian exchanged her noon hours with her assistant so she could join her aunt and Jack for lunch at Young's Restaurant on Market Street near the Ferry Building in San Francisco. After the luncheon, London was to be photographed in Klondike gear borrowed from the museum in the Ferry Building to illustrate an article that Netta was writing about him for the Overland Monthly. According to Charmian's recollection of the day, she walked into the bustling cafe and saw her aunt seated with a rough but handsome young man. She was immediately struck by Jack's wide-set gray eyes and his full-lipped mouth. When she walked over to the table, Jack awkwardly stood up and stuck out his hand to shake hers. When she took his hand, she was surprised by his forceful handshake. They sat down, and her aunt introduced her and bragged about her star role at the shipping firm. Jack was filled with curiosity and seemed to hang on every word the two women spoke. He asked her about the origin of her name and what it meant. She explained that her mother was a poet and had chosen it because in ancient Greek it means what comes from joy. With the mention of literature, Jack asked if she had ever read Kipling, especially the short story, The Brushwood Boy. Charmian answered that, yes, of course, she adored Kipling. When Jack asked what she was reading, Charmian told him Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles as her answer, and Jack nearly jumped out of his chair, telling her he'd been trying to get his hand on that book for weeks, but couldn't because the library would not carry banned books. When Charmian offered to lend it to him, he was thrilled. Netta asked Charmian if she would review The Son of the Wolf, Houghton Mifflin's forthcoming collection of Jack's Overland Monthly stories. When Charmian cautiously agreed, Jack offered to have the early proof sheet sent to her. "It's a go, Miss Kittredge. I'll hold you to that." At the end of the luncheon, Jack asked when he could see Charmian again, so they could talk books and he could borrow Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Netta intervened to suggest that Jack accompany Herman Jim Whitaker when he came by to be interviewed for her perspective on Jack. Jack agreed to come to their home in Berkeley before Charmian left the two of them to their photo shoot and headed back to her office. So they had many meetings in Charmian's den, which is the room she rented from her aunt in Berkeley. But while they were developing this friendship, Jack sent a letter on a Saturday morning that said in a letter that Sunday evening that the following Saturday he was going to be marrying Bessie Mattern, and everyone was surprised by that move. So Charmian, because of that, and because she was ready to make a change in her life and had always been interested in what her father's life was like in Mount Desert Island, started off on a journey across the country by train to Mount Desert Island, and from there went on a trip around Europe and wrote, and that was her first travel journals. But I'm gonna jump ahead to my last section I'm going to read, which is from the infamous Snark Journey. So Jack and Charmian, as most of you know, ended up getting married, and they both loved adventure. And one of the biggest adventures that they planned together was the Snark Journey, which took place. They sailed on April 23rd, 1907, after much delay, including from the 1906 earthquake. But once they were underway, this became a place where Charmian really started to come into her own as a writer. She was collecting, she was writing a diary about her everyday experiences with the goal of creating a book. And those notes would eventually become Log of the Snark, which is her first published book. So I'm going to take you through the first section of their time in Hawaii. Here we go. And it was meant to be a 7-year journey. However, things went wrong and they came back much sooner than that. A few hours after they set sail, a wave soaked Charmian's typewriter, leaving it almost inoperable, and everyone on board became desperately seasick. She was only able to begin her log of her experiences on the trip at 3 days out. Once the boat had reached deep water, it was the first time she had ever seen deep water, and its purple hue was so otherworldly, it reminded her of the dreamlike images painted by Maxfield Parrish in The Seven Voyages of Sinbad the Sailor. A treasured book from her childhood in the old clapboard house in Oakland. Soon they encountered creatures she had never seen before, clouds of purple man-of-war jellyfish sailing on the water's surface, and many goonies, birds that looked like dark gray overgrown seagulls. 4 days into their voyage, the boat hit rough water, and they discovered that the Snark would not heave to. They couldn't fix the position of the helm and sail to make it possible for the ship to steer its own course without anyone at the helm. Someone would always need to be on watch. That day, they also discovered that the sea anchor had failed. So if a storm hit, it would be difficult to stabilize the boat. Jack was utterly disappointed, and so was Charmian. Their long dreamed of adventure was off to a rocky start. The inexperienced crew, many of whom had never been at sea, consisted of the captain, Charmian's uncle Roscoe Ames, the cook, Martin Johnson, the cabin boy, Tochiki, and Bert Stoltz, the engineer. Charmian was the only woman in the confined space of the yacht. She spent many frustrating hours on her hands and knees, scouring the greasy littered floors of the engine room, the bathroom, and the 2 staterooms, which had not been cleaned before they left port. As she records in her diary, "We are all filthy on the filthy boat." Except for Jack, the sick and demoralized crew still couldn't leave their bunks, so much of the work fell upon her. She had known life at sea would be difficult, but was most surprised by the number of bruises she acquired from falls and bumps on the ship. Every inch of her seemed to be black and blue. As she records in the log, the smallness of the boat, the nearness of the water, and particularly the size of the waves would about wreck a nervous woman. Charmian, however, was not a nervous woman who intended special treatment. She quickly grew into what was required of her in her life at sea. Her uncle Roscoe, who was supposed to be in charge, proved unsuited to be a leader. He was unable to get the sickened crew to do anything, and though he had experience navigating boats on San Francisco Bay, He had no idea how to navigate the boat's course in deep water. Not surprisingly, Cyrus R. Teed's cellular cosmogony couldn't help them find their course. This was the navigational system that Roscoe was trying to use, where you navigated as if the Earth was in a sphere inside of a sphere, that the Earth was a sphere inside of a sphere, and you were navigating through that. It was not very effective, to say the least. Jack was furious. He unseated Roscoe as captain and made a contract with the rest of the crew to create order on the boat. Things improved, but the 26 days it would take them to sail to Hawaii would be filled with mishap and misadventures that left both the Snark and its crew in desperate shape when they finally approached the harbor at Honolulu. Evenings, as the wind pushed their yacht forward, Charmian would sit with Jack, watching the copper-streaked sky before the sunset and the sky filled with the clarity of stars. Charmian, who had carefully selected books she would read on board the Snark, read and heavily annotated Isabella Lucy Bird's book, The Hawaiian Archipelago, 6 months among the palm groves, coral reefs, and volcanoes of the Sandwich Islands, 1875. Bird, like Charmian, was a woman not bound by conventions. She rode astride and often dressed in trousers. Although her book was written about 30 years before the Snark Journey, it is no wonder that Charmian resonated with the work of a woman with whom she had so much in common. Such works gave her access to a literary tradition that shaped her own writing. While on board, Charmian quickly realized that normal female attire would not allow her to do the work she needed to do on the boat. So she began wearing her blue flannel bloomers instead, pants she had made for working aboard the boat. And at this time, that was scandalous. When Jack saw her wearing pants on deck, he admired her androgyny, calling her his, quote, twin brother and sweetheart. Somehow, in the confined space of the Snark, they found privacy enough to make love, and Charmaine records each lolly in her diary, as she called it. When the snow-capped summit of Mauna Kea and the blue shape of Halekalala, a giant extinct volcano on the island of Maui, rose from the sea, Charmian was flooded with relief at seeing land again. They chose not to dock in Honolulu, even though hundreds of people were waiting to catch a glimpse of them because Jack was embarrassed at the state of disrepair of the Snark. Instead, they sailed on to Pearl Harbor. The hillsides on shore were terraced with rice fields, and the air, now still, was sticky with humidity. Charmian and Jack were as giddy as children as they entered Pearl Harbor, the first port in their adventure. And I'm going to jump ahead to the first time they went surfing. In the ensuing days, they rode the red hills to the top of Diamond Peak on horseback. Then, with their new friend, Alexander Hume Ford, who wanted to reintroduce the sport of surfing to draw more tourists to Hawaii, Jack and Charmian spent a day surfing the waves of Waikiki. Charmian was proud to catch a wave several times. So was Jack. But he also got one of the worst sunburns of his life and had to spend nearly a week in bed recovering. When Jack wrote about his experiences surfing in the essay, A Royal Sport, he failed to mention that his wife had also successfully mastered a run or two. It was an omission that would reoccur throughout Jack's account of the trip. Charmian understood, just as she had several years ago when she wrote Jack London Afloat for Sunset Magazine, that Jack's brand was adventure. The more daring and interesting he appeared in his episodes about their trip, the more copies he would sell. And his fear of surfing on a 10-foot wooden surfboard would not have looked so adventurous if his small, fit wife had also accomplished the exact same thing. She did, however, proudly note the event in her own diary. I'm going to read one more little bit about their trip to Molokai, which is a very special place for Jack and Charmian. They stayed with J.D. McVeigh, the superintendent who oversaw the 1,100 patients of the colony there and spent their first day touring the area and visiting the various homes for the lepers. When Jack and Charmian toured the premises, they were filled with compassion for the people who lived there. Quote, "It took all our steel at first to avoid shrinking from their hideousness, but assured as we were of the safety of mingling, our concern was earnestly to let them know that we were unafraid." And it made such a touching difference. Spending time with the patients allowed her to appreciate their dignity. Quote, "They ride and live and love like other people." The week that Charmian spent on Molokai would change the way she saw those who were suffering from the disease. What she and Jack had seen at the leper ward of the hospital in Havana on their honeymoon had been more like a sanitarium. Patients lived confined in the four walls of a hospital and were never permitted to leave. On Molokai, although the lepers were still isolated from their families and friends, they lived freely on the island. Most were unabashed and uninhibited about their diseased bodies. To Charmian and Jack, Molokai felt like a community, more like a community than a place of quarantine. In a letter to Netta, Charmian revealed that she felt Molokai was misunderstood. Can you imagine the dreaded leper settlement of Molokai as a place of great beauty, of scenery, with little homes smothered in vines and people owning their own horses, a nice racetrack, 2 brass bands, 3 or 4 string quartets and quintets with voices, great sports on holidays, schools, playgrounds, pianos. At dawn on the 4th of July, they awoke to strange notes. They quickly dressed in their kimonos and went outside. They found, quote, a score or so of lepers, or horribles, as they ironically called themselves, wearing masks that accentuated their deformities. The sense of comfort that they were able to convey, despite their misshapen bodies, made Charmian realize that here on Molokai, perhaps it was she who was the other, the person different from everyone else. As she wrote, "Great heaven, do our normal countenances appear abnormal to them?" Charmian dressed and went to watch the famed Pau riders ride in to begin the day of festivities. Even though they were celebrating July 4, a day glorifying the country that had colonized their islands, the residents of Molokai confronted the ceremonies with a beautiful display of Hawaiian tradition. First, she heard the thunder of hooves, and then in the silver light of dawn, a wave of women rode over the hill on horseback. Each wore a long, colorful skirt that fluttered behind like a defiant flag. She was amazed at how well the girls rode as Jack clicked photographs of their, quote, reckless grace and ease. Their colorful pageant was an old Hawaiian tradition kept alive in this far-off leper colony, and it opened Charmian to the depth of the culture she saw before her. As she learned from the older women, quote, the whole was a picture of old Hawaii, not to be found elsewhere in the territory, and certainly nowhere else in the world. For no set of reproduction of the bygone customs could equal this whole-souled exhibition, costume from simple materials by older women who remembered days of the past, carried out in the natural order of life in one of the most beautiful spots in the islands, if not on the globe. By the time they left Molokai, educated by their intense experiences, Charmian had begun to see the island and their people as something as ancient, as mysterious, and alive as the sea. She was struck by the enormity of the fact that the queen had been dethroned. What was at stake wasn't just pomp and circumstance, but an entire culture. Thank you. So now we will be moving on to questions. Go ahead and place your questions in the chat box. While we're getting the questions set up, just another reminder that you can buy the book at jacklondonpark.com, and I will happily personalize your book for you. And all the proceeds, that's a way to support the park, because right now, due to wildfires nearby, we are closed. The park is closed, so we do want to keep supporting the park. Do we have a question?
We have a question this comes from Karen. Karen says, wonderful event, Iris. What was your biggest discovery or aha moment while creating the book?
Well, I think the biggest discovery or aha moment was when I found out that Charmian had helped write some of Jack London's works, including The Valley of the Moon, which is one of my favorite novels by Jack London. So in her Diaries, she recorded scenes that she had written that actually appear in the book.
We have another question from Nicole. What were your favorite areas of research?
I think my favorite area of research was getting to see Charmian's development as a writer, because I didn't really know that I knew she'd written books, but I didn't know that she really aspired to be a writer. And so getting to read her diaries, which is really strange to read. She had a lot of diaries. And so you really get to see what she was like and what she was thinking, and compare, especially the Snark Journey. There are diaries, her personal diaries. There are letters she wrote to Netta, her aunt, and then there's also, the Log of the Snark, her book that she wrote. And so it was neat to see the differences between all of those. That's probably the best part of the research.
This question is coming to us from Jennifer. Jennifer says, thanks, Iris. This is sort of an oddball one. Did you find any information on where Charmian's unusual first name came from? She seems to be the only woman in the world ever so named. Thanks again.
Yes, that's a great question. She was the word, her name means what comes from joy in ancient Greek. And what's really interesting is it's something that she really connected to, because the only child she was able to carry to term, she named Joy. So what came from joy was joy.
Here's another Charmian related name from Charmian.
Oh, wow.
My parents named me Charmian after visiting Wolf House when they were pregnant with me. I would love to get a signed copy as well.
That's such a cool story. Yeah, well, I would love to sign a book to Charmian.
Here is a question from Andrea. Hi, Iris. Thanks so much for sharing this cool book launch. What was the most challenging part of researching and writing this biography of Charmian?
I think that, one of the most difficult parts of researching and writing this biography was not the actual research. There was a lot to research and a lot to do, but it was getting publishers behind the idea of telling the story of a woman. It's, for some reason, it's very difficult to take on a story like this and publish it. And I am very grateful to University of Oklahoma Press for seeing the vision of this book and bringing it to fruition. I think there's a lot of stories that we need to look at again from the perspective of the women in those stories in order to really have a fuller understanding of history. And I look forward to writing more biographies like this that really question history and how we've accepted it.
Here's a question from Larry. Why did you choose the picture of Charmian in the rain for the cover?
I chose this picture because I really thought that this depicted Charmian in her essence, like as an adventurer, as a traveler. I think a lot of times she wasn't super photogenic. So she often, like you can see that she's just kind of like experiencing things. She's not like the ladies of her day who would pose, and she was always like laughing or, having fun. And so I felt like this actually kind of depicted who she was. And I was really grateful to the Huntington Library for allowing me to use this for my cover.
Here's a question from Kathleen Walsh, who'd like to know, how did writing and researching this book change your perception of Jack?
That's a really good question. Like I said, I started coming here in the 6th grade and basically bought every single book by Jack London and have been reading him ever since. And I did, consider myself a Jack London scholar at the time that I started on the journey of this project. By looking at this story through Charmian's eyes, I see a lot of the events that were reported on are slightly different when you look at them through Charmian's experiences. For example, when their affair started is a little bit different. Also the way, the example I gave you with the Snark Journey, like the way that Jack recorded things, it was just him doing all these adventures, but she was right there keeping up with him. And I think that's really the most exciting thing, is to see that that she was his equal in many ways, athletically and intellectually. They were very similar, and I would have loved to have seen a conversation between the two of them, because it would have been very entertaining, I'm sure.
This question comes from Christy. Christy would like to know, which part of her life do you find more interesting, during her marriage to Jack London or the years afterwards?
Well, I happen to be biased now. I really love her years before she met Jack London. I know that wasn't one of my possible answers, but it's fascinating to learn about her childhood, and also about the time she went to Mills College, and when she traveled around Europe and then around the United States on her own. And really you get to see that kind of the idea of adventure forming in her, and that idea of wanting to be there and experience things firsthand as a way to write about it. And then after Jack dies, you see this transformation in her to really focus on a life of being a writer. It's another fascinating time. I take it on in a later chapter called Of Two Minds, and it's kind of her transformation after widowhood.
Here's a question from Charles, who would like to know how much of Valley of the Moon is true to Jack and Charmian's own experience. Clearly, they already knew Glen Ellen and did not have to discover it.
That's true. Yes, you do see glimpses of the local area. But they went on a 4-horse tour up. They went up the coast. They went out to Bodega Bay, went up by Jenner, went all the way up the coast, and then back down through the middle of up to Oregon and back down, and gathered information from in order to write this novel. So they did that work together. So all of the notes for the novel they wrote together. And so their experiences are, I think a lot of times people get confused about the characters in Jack London's books, thinking, well, Billy, who's the male protagonist, is based on Jack, and Saxon, the female protagonist, is based on Charmian. And while there are some great points, like Saxon has a poet mother, just like Charmian, and she even, one of my favorite scenes is she has this corset that she wraps around her waist as a way to be close to her mother. And this is something that Charmian actually had as one of the artifacts she kept with her from her mother, who died quite young. She would wrap her mother's corset around her waist. So moments like that you can see, or the part that I don't want to ruin Valley of the Moon for everybody, but there is a point where Saxon loses a baby, and so Charmian had just lost Joy Baby, their only child that they had together, that died shortly after childbirth. And so she was able to use those experiences to help Jack write about what it's like to be a woman and lose your child. And I think that really helped him be able to write in a way about women's experiences that was far ahead of his time, because in fact they were collaborating on parts like that.
Here's a question from Jennifer. Where did your research take you? Obviously in Sonoma, but which other archives did you access?
I accessed archives in Berkeley and in Logan, Utah, but mainly I accessed a lot of archives at the Huntington Library in Southern California.
Kathleen would like to know, at this great biography took 6 years to write, did you visit the places where Charmian and her parents resided? Also, how are the shepherds related to Charmian?
I did not get to go to Mount Desert Island, which I'm very sad about, and I do want to visit someday. But I did visit many of the places in order to be able to write about them. I think it's important that, and the shepherds are related through Eliza, through Jack's stepsister. But in order for the way that I write, and I think it's, this is a little bit of a different kind of biography where like the opening scene is set on Sonoma Mountain. And it's a place where it's right out there. You could look through the lens, you would see. I've hiked that mountain many, many times. I've felt the wind on on my face hiking up there. I've heard the hawks screaming, and I know what it's like on a hot day there. It's very hot. And so it was easy for me to try to recreate that scene based on those physical experiences. So as a writer, I like to actually immerse myself in the sensory details of a place when I write about it.
Sue would like to know, first of all, she says, thanks, Iris. Do you think Charmian would have become a professional writer if she hadn't married Jack? Do you feel she was fulfilled by being Jack's mate and fellow adventurer?
That's a really good question. I do think that I think that Charmian was deeply in love with Jack London, and I think they had a really amazing intellectual and physical connection. I do think that he did make her life difficult, but I think the love they shared as mates, as partners in that way overseeded all of that. I do think as Jack got sicker and sicker towards the end of his life, it became much harder for her to not have the independence that she really thrived from. And if you, when you read the book, you'll see that independence was one of the most important things to Charmian. And so when she did become Jack's partner, it was a big, letting go of that independence. And while she did still have independence when she was with him, it was a busy life, keeping up with Jack London and helping editing his work, and there wasn't a lot of time for her to do her own work.
Cindy would like to know, did Charmian have a group of peers who could relate to her spirit of adventure and bucking the norms in a male world?
She did. Charmian had lots of friends. One of her earliest friends, Pauline French, lived in New York, and she visited her when she went back to Mount Desert Island when she was younger, after she met Jack, and she decided to travel the world. And they went on a journey to the 1901 exhibition in Buffalo. And it's just really cool to read about like what they did in New York and what they did. She lived in the same way, a sense of adventure as Charmian, and had traveled the world. Charmian kept all her postcards. And later in life, Charmian became very close to Osa Osa Johnson, Martin Johnson's wife, especially after Martin Johnson passed away and she became a widow. Martin and Osa were adventure writers as well. Martin was on the Snark voyage. This was before he met Osa. And they traveled all around the world and made films about their experiences. And I think in some ways, maybe Charm was a little bit jealous that, Martin was alive and they got to travel together. And she was signed up to do a South American tour right before World War I broke out, and she was unable to go on the tour.
Joe has a question. Do you think that Charmian, in her diaries, tended to sugarcoat Jack's less attractive habits or his monetary failures?
No, she did not. She let it all out in those journals. I think it's most obvious when you read her Dirigo Diaries. So the Dirigo Journey is the trip that she and Jack took from Baltimore around Cape Horn to Seattle. And Jack was on a total bender in New York before they got on that trip, and she was pissed. In fact, there's a picture of them, I think it's in here, of them in front of Edgar Allan Poe's grave in Baltimore, and Charmian had just cut off 6 inches of her hair. She's so mad at him, and she's just like, everybody looks mad in the picture. And she didn't even speak to him much the first few days on that trip. Other times, he did eventually stop drinking. He often did while they were at sea. But for example, on the Snark, he said he wouldn't smoke. And then as soon as they got to Hawaii, he'd be like, well, I'm just going to have like a couple a day. And she'd complain in her diary all the time about Jack's bad habits, but also his temper. He had a very, he would have big reactions to things, and he would get into moods, and she'd have to be careful around it. And she wrote it all down. I don't think she intended someone to read all her diaries.
Roberta would like to know, do you think Charmian felt Jack truly loved her, or was she insecure about his love for her?
That's a good question. I do think she thought he truly loved her. I think they had, so Charmian grew up in an open marriage, meaning her aunt and her uncle Roscoe saw other people in their marriage. And so her idea of a conventional marriage was quite different than most people of her era. I don't know that Jack and Charmian were completely monogamous at all times, but I think looking back, we all judge that as something that was bad for the relationship. But I think actually Charmian embraced that due to her background. And she was someone who was very sensual. They had a very active sex life, and they were very much in love. It's written all over the diaries.
Barbara would like to know, did Charmian fall in love again after Jack's passing?
That's a good question. I'm kind of surprised that we haven't gotten a Houdini question yet. It's like a record. So Charmian, after Jack passed away, was still in her 40s. Like, she was still a woman of she was somebody who was gonna try to partner again. But after Jack died, she was so relieved to not have to completely saddle her life next to someone else. I think as a writer, and then also someone who felt responsible for Jack London's career, of his legacy, really, of keeping it going. She wasn't looking for like a life partner. Shortly after, she dated many men. Most famously, she dated Houdini for a short time. When she went to New York, she was working on getting the publishing contract for the biography she would write about Jack London. And so Houdini, who she'd met, she and Jack met Houdini and his wife in 1913. And so they went to one of his shows, and they all hit it off, and they had Thanksgiving together. And then when Jack died, Houdini sent her a letter of condolences. And so when Charmian said, oh, I'm going to be traveling to New York, Houdini's like, well, you got to come to my show. And so she showed up, and she describes in detail what she was wearing, because that was something Charmian did in her diaries. She went to the show twice in a day, which I did some research to realize that wasn't as unusual as it seems to us now. And she he immediately invited her to dinner with he and his wife, which is a great way to make an impression, which she declined, but then they started dating shortly after that. And for a few weeks, she'd write in her diary every one of their encounters. She would refer to him as her magic lover. And but what happened quickly is that Houdini started to really become obsessed with Charmian and want a relationship, even though he was married. And Charmian was just like not ready for somebody to, this is 2 years after Jack's death. She wasn't ready for this intensity again of somebody who is, Houdini had a big personality, right? She wasn't ready to be second stage to a man again. She wanted to focus on her life, wanted to focus on her writing. And so she walked away from that after a few short weeks and came back to California.
Barbara would like to know, how long were the Londons aware as a couple that Jack was seriously and terminally ill?
That's a really good question. I think this is where hindsight is 2020. It's easy for us to look back and say, well, why didn't you know rubbing, this mercury ointment on your yaws sores is not going to kill you. That wasn't something that they knew at the time. And if you know anyone who's experienced kidney failure or kidney issues, it's the number of different symptoms that you feel, especially at that time, they all coordinate to other things. And so he started to feel like when he had his appendicitis, the doctor saw that there was something going on, and he's like, you got to cut back on your 4-minute duck. You got to cut back on your, heavy drinking. And Jack did actually, as he got sicker and sicker, he did stop drinking as much because he just couldn't absorb the alcohol. He was so bloated. I don't know that I think they were in denial about how sick he was. If many people have seen the film clips of Jack on the ranch here, the film crew that came here just 6 days before he passed away, he does look alive. But she did record in her diary that she thought she saw death in his eyes. And so I think she was coming to terms. He had these mood swings going on. He was very bloated. It was not, his body was just retaining so much fluid. And so I do think she was aware, but I think that she thought he was invincible the way that he thought he was.
Susan is curious. Question. I'm curious about Charmian's diaries. Are all of her diaries held at Huntington? I have read at some point that some of her diaries were also held privately. Thank you, from Susan.
There are many diaries that are not available. For instance, when Charmian went through the debacle with Irving Stone, he broke into her safe downstairs and read her early diaries. The diary from 1900 still exists, but all the other diaries from the 1890s, she destroyed after he did that because she was so distraught by the fact that somebody had betrayed her trust in that way. Also, what she recorded was the lifestyle of a modern woman. And many people who would read that from, like, for example, Irving Stone, from his perspective, she was just a loose lady, right? She was dating several men at one time. She was a career woman. She was more focused on herself than on presenting herself in order to become a good wife. And so it's really, it's devastating to not have all of those diaries. And if there are more diaries available in collections that I didn't have access to when I wrote this book, I would love to hear about them.
This question comes from Elisa. Was the writing in the diaries always as tiny and cramped as her later ones?
No. her diaries started to get more and more cramped, and she'd write in all different directions on the page later in her life, especially as she started to have dementia, and she had a stroke as well. So the last year of Diaries is really difficult to read. But the early ones, she did have crazy handwriting. I won't say that it was ever easy to decipher her handwriting, but you kind of get the feel for it after a while.
This comes from Karen. Iris, this was great. I'm part of a book club. Can you suggest questions to discuss?
I would be happy to. Just contact me after the event, for sure. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions.
Here's one from Jennifer. I've heard that Charmian's diaries, some of them were written in an elaborate code. Were you able to decode all of her diaries?
She writes some of her entries in shorthand, and so some of the it is a shorthand that is very difficult to decipher. And no, I couldn't decipher all of those passages. Again, there is more scholarship to be done in this area, and I'm so excited that that there's all this interest. I hope my book makes more people study Charmian and more books be written about her, because there's so much more to learn.
I think we're going to take one last question, and this is from Larry. Would Charmian be considered a woman's liber today?
That's an interesting question, because I think our idea of what that means is really different. So in the late 1800s, Charmian lived in Berkeley and Oakland with a family that was pretty bohemian. Her aunt and uncle followed the ideas of Victoria Woodhouse about women having more rights, and also more an open idea about sexuality. And I think that really stuck in Charmian. I think she never thought that her gender should stop her from doing what she wanted to do with her life. And in that sense, she was very much a modern woman. But she lived in a time where that was really debilitating for her. And because of that, it's really made that the way that she's remembered is tainted by that. And so I think it's going to be a slow process, especially for a lot of women of that generation, because there were so many of them that lived very differently from how we perceive women lived in that time. And so I think you could call her, I think she was just a new woman. She was part of a movement of women that lived without the ideas of gender norms, stopping them from doing what they wanted. If they were going to be on a boat, they were going to wear pants. I mean, who would want to be in a giant skirt, on a ship? It would kill you. So, or if you're going to ride a horse, you're going to make your own pants so you can ride a horse, not side saddle, but astride. So.
All right, I think this one will absolutely be our last question. There's been so many of them, but this one I love. This is from Barbara, and what Barbara would like to know is, when was the amazing photo, when and where, the amazing photo behind you on the wall taken?
Wonderful. So this photo here of Charmian, it's so nice to share the stage with her, was taken at the cottage over on the other side of the park. It's from the garden over there, and they like to have a really natural garden when they kept the garden themselves. I do want to end by thanking Jack London State Park profusely. Thank you so much for letting me launch my book, even though there's so much going on in the world right now. It means so much to be able to launch it here. Also, thank you to all of you for tuning in. I know the last thing that people want to do is be stuck to a screen right now, so I really appreciate it. And if you have any questions that weren't answered, please know that I will be getting a list of those questions afterwards, and I will personally email you an answer. So if you had some dying question that you didn't get to, put in the chat, I'm happy to answer it for you. And I'm also happy to just talk about Charmian with you. So don't forget, get the book from Jack London State Park at www.jacklondonstatepark.com, and I will sign it for you. Thank you so much.